In this video, I'll be rebuilding the throttle body on a Porsche 944 using a new seal kit, as well as performing a smoke test to check for vacuum leaks. The throttle body on an 8-valve, naturally aspirated 944 is located here between the intake J-boot and the intake manifold. Inside the throttle body are a few rubber O-rings that tend to dry out and break down over time, which results in vacuum leaks that can negatively impact engine performance. You can check for vacuum leaks by performing a smoke test on the intake, which we'll do in a moment, but these units are basically 40 years old at this point, so adding a throttle body rebuild to your maintenance list is a good thing to consider. This throttle body kit was originally designed by Arnworks and has since been picked up by the folks at Carpokes. It's available from the Carpokes website or 944 online for about $43. It includes new O-rings for the throttle body to the intake, the throttle position sensor, the idle adjustment valve, the throttle body shaft, and the Venturi tube if so equipped. Also included in the kit is a nut and serrated washer for the throttle cam, a circlip for the throttle shaft, 2 Phillips head screws for the throttle plate, and 2 M4 socket head screws for the throttle position sensor. The throttle body is secured to the intake manifold by 4 M6 hex key bolts, with the lower ones being partially blocked by some other components, so we'll need to remove the air filter housing and the intake boot for better access. The filter housing and the airflow meter can be removed as one assembly by removing the 2 10mm bolts on the rear mounting bracket, followed by the 2 on the front mounting bracket. The breather hose attached to the side of the airbox will also need to be disconnected, along with the electrical connector for the airflow meter. This car has a MAF kit installed in place of the factory AFM, but the OEM connector features a metal spring clip that can be released with a small flathead screwdriver to remove the connector. Next, disconnect the intake boot by loosening the ring clamp and separate the two parts. With everything disconnected, the assembly can be lifted and removed from the engine. From here, we'll perform a smoke test on the intake system using a smoke machine to check for leaks. This particular machine features a built-in air pump that connects to the car's battery. We've also got a 4-inch cone adapter here that will be installed in the J-boot and tightened down a little. The throttle valve can be wedged open with a screwdriver to allow smoke to pass through the system. With everything connected and some smoke fluid added to the chamber, we can turn on the pump and blow some smoke. This nozzle connects to the tube on the cone adapter to pressurize the system, and it usually only takes a couple minutes to highlight any leaks. We're looking for signs of smoke escaping from anywhere in the system. Loose connections and broken vacuum lines are common to see, but I've also seen random leaks from a broken thermo vacuum valve under the intake manifold, this top connection on the 1988 model year containing an O-ring that can fail, and of course the throttle body itself, where smoke tends to emanate from the valve shaft area. Once you've made note of any other leaks for repair, it's time to remove the throttle body. First, disconnect the throttle body cable spring from the spring arm by lifting it out of the hole. Next, disconnect the throttle cable by rotating the throttle cam into an open position and slide the cable from the retaining notch. Disconnect the 2 small vacuum lines on the side of the throttle body by pulling them straight off. Then release the electrical connector for the throttle position switch by opening the spring clip with a screwdriver. Next, remove the intake boot from the throttle body by loosening the ring clamp and separating the two parts. Finally, remove the 4 M6 mounting bolts using a 5mm hex key tool or an Allen wrench. The lower inside bolt can be removed by disconnecting the spark plug lead for the number 1 cylinder and sliding a socket extension under the J-boot. And with all the bolts removed, the throttle body can be pulled away from the engine. We're now ready to disassemble the throttle body, starting with the throttle position switch that sits at the bottom of the assembly. Remove the 2 Phillips head screws and carefully separate the TPS from the throttle body casing. I say carefully because a new TPS costs about $700 from Porsche, or about $150 for aftermarket options, so you don't want to break it. With the TPS removed, we can remove and discard the O-ring, as this will be replaced with a new one in the kit. Next, we'll be removing the idle adjustment screw, but first we need to make note of its current position for reinstallation. Depending on the year and model of your 944, we'll need either a flathead screwdriver or a 7mm deep socket to remove the screw. Start by turning the adjustment screw clockwise until it's lightly seated, while making note of the number of turns it requires from the existing setting. If this step is skipped, an initial setting of 2.5 turns counterclockwise from seated should be used for reinstallation. Next, completely remove the air valve adjustment screw and discard the O-ring, as we'll be replacing this with a new one. Back on the bottom of the assembly, remove the shaft clip with a tiny pair of circlip pliers or a pair of pick tools. With the circlip removed, the clip washer can now be removed and set aside for reinstallation. On the other end, remove the shaft nut with a 13mm wrench, along with the serrated washer and the throttle cam. From here, we can remove the throttle plate from the shaft. First, use a Sharpie or a scribe to make small witness marks on the plate near the screw heads, which will help ensure the correct up and down positioning during reassembly. Now the throttle shaft screws can be removed with a Phillips head screwdriver. Note here that during manufacturing, the threaded ends of the screws were peened after installation to prevent them from backing out. So if you're not able to easily loosen the screws, a small grinder or a Dremel may be needed to grind away the threads that were peened. With the screws removed, hold the shaft in the wide open throttle position and remove the throttle plate. Next, pull the shaft from the throttle body casting and ensure the thin washer remains in position for reassembly. Finally, the old seals can be removed from the shaft bore. There are 2 seals here, one on each side, usually located outward from the 2 pin bearings, but occasionally they're found inward. These seals have often become dried out and broken up into small pieces. Inspect and clean these areas so the space is clear for the new seals to be installed. Once clean, you'll notice that the pin bearings can be slid in or out slightly, where they should be pushed inward to create a groove to accommodate the new seals during reassembly. This is a good time to clean the metal parts of the throttle body by soaking them in a cleaning solution to remove foreign materials. A stiff bristle brush can be used, along with some throttle body cleaner or compressed air to clean out all the passageways. Once everything is cleaned up, we can begin reassembly, starting with a new set of shaft seals. These are the 3 smallest seals in the kit, one for each side of the assembly, and one spare if needed. Squeeze the seal and insert it about halfway into the bore. Next, push the protruding end of the seal down into the slot above the bearing. With the seal partially seated, pull the remaining sections of the seal up into position with tweezers or a small screwdriver, then gently push around the inner circumference to ensure the seal is fully seated without damaging it. One shaft seal should be located on the outer side of the 2 pin bearings for the top and bottom of the throttle body. Next, apply some O-ring grease or a silicone-based lubricant to each of the seals to make the shaft installation a little smoother. Inspect the shaft surface for burrs or sharp edges that could damage the new seals and use a small file to clean up the machined edges as needed. Ensure that the spring is properly oriented on the shaft with a thin washer in place, and gently install the shaft into the throttle body using a rocking motion and steady pressure to avoid damaging the seals. Once inserted, rotate the shaft so that the throttle stops align with their correct final position, and ensure it's fully seated in the assembly. Next, insert the throttle plate back into the notch at the center of the shaft, while ensuring it's in the correct orientation by following the witness marks created during disassembly. You'll want to make sure the plate is well centered and fits within the bore of the throttle body. A poor fitment here will result in a high or unstable idle condition. Install the new Phillips head screws into the shaft and tighten them down. Check for smooth operation and seating of the plate when placed in the idle or closed position, and confirm the plate rotates freely and easily returns to the idle position. If the metal tang doesn't fully touch the idle set screw when closed, the plate is binding within the bore and should be loosened and repositioned. A small amount of WD-40 or thin machine oil can be applied to the shaft bore area to help seat the seals and allow the shaft to rotate freely. At this point, it's important to make sure the idle return spring is correctly positioned, as the orientation may have changed during disassembly. The hooked side of the spring should wrap around the spring arm, and the straight side of the spring should rest behind the tang for the idle set screw. If the straight side of the spring is resting on the spring arm, push it down behind the idle set screw tang and back into position. At the bottom of the throttle body, reinstall the shaft washer and the new circlip on the end of the shaft using some small snap ring pliers or a pair of pick tools. A screw can also be threaded into the notch on the circlip to wedge it open for installation. Once the clip is open, slide it onto the shaft and press it down into position. At the base of the shaft, remove the screw and use a screwdriver to ensure the clip is fully seated within the groove on the shaft. With the new clip installed, we can reinstall the throttle cam on the top of the assembly while ensuring it's properly engaged with the throttle stop tang. Next, the new serrated washer and the 13mm nut can be installed and tightened down to secure the throttle cam. Once the cam is installed, confirm again that the throttle plate rotates freely and fully returns to the idle position. If needed, loosen the screws and adjust the throttle plate position before final tightening. To ensure the screws don't vibrate loose and enter the intake, either blue Loctite 242 should be applied during final tightening, or the threads can be peened after installation. While Loctite is the recommended approach by the kit's designer, the threads can be peened by placing a Phillips head screwdriver in a vise with the tip facing upwards. Position the throttle body so that one of the screws is squarely engaged by the tip of the screwdriver and supporting the assembly. While holding the throttle body in this position, a flat tip drift or a small hammer can be carefully applied to the outer diameter of the threads to deform them slightly and lock the screw in place. Inspect and repeat this process on the second plate screw. Next, we'll be reinstalling the idle adjustment valve by screwing it back into position. First, install the new O-ring onto the valve. This one will be slightly larger in diameter than the shaft seals we just installed. With the O-ring installed, tighten the screw down until it's lightly seated, and then turn it counterclockwise to loosen the screw by the number of turns noted during disassembly. Again, if the number of turns was not initially recorded during removal, start with a setting of 2.5 turns counterclockwise. From here, the throttle position switch can be reinstalled at the base of the throttle body. First, install a new O-ring on the top of the TPS, which will be the medium-sized seal remaining in the kit. Place the TPS onto the throttle body with the connector port facing the opposite direction of the idle adjustment valve, and loosely secure it using the 2 socket head flange screws. The TPS must now be clocked correctly to provide the correct electrical signals to the DME computer for the idle and wide open throttle positions. To do so, first ensure the throttle plate is in the fully closed or idle position. Next, twist the TPS counterclockwise until it stops, and tighten down the screws while holding it lightly against the stops. When adjusted correctly, you should hear a faint clicking sound just as the throttle plate is opened about 1 degree, which is the action of the idle position microswitch. Make any adjustments as needed to ensure the switch actuates when the throttle is opened. Once it's set correctly, this is a good time to test the switch functionality by performing some resistance tests with an ohm meter. The TPS connector has markings for the 3 terminals labeled as 3, 18, and 2. To test the idle contact, apply the leads to terminals 2 and 18, where it should read 0 ohms with the throttle plate fully closed and infinite ohms with throttle open. To test the full throttle contact, apply the leads to terminals 3 and 18, where it should read 0 ohms with the throttle plate fully open, and infinite ohms when closed or at partial throttle. If you're not getting the correct readings for either of these tests, loosen the screws and clock the TPS until it's adjusted correctly. We've now rebuilt the throttle body with all new seals, and it's time to install it on the engine. First, install the largest O-ring from the kit on the back of the throttle body and slide it back into place on the intake manifold. Ensure it's seated properly and secure it by installing and hand tightening the 4 M6 mounting bolts. Use a 5mm hex key tool or an Allen wrench to fully tighten down the bolts. Slide the intake boot back onto the throttle body and secure the ring clamp with a screwdriver. Next, reconnect the electrical connector for the throttle position switch. Push the 2 small vacuum lines onto their connections on the side of the throttle body until they're firmly seated. Rotate the throttle cam into an open position and slide the throttle cable into the retaining notch. Make sure it's fully seated and release the cam. Finally, reattach the throttle body cable spring to the spring arm by looping it back into the hole. With the throttle body reinstalled, lightly tap on the throttle cable to ensure the TPS is still actuating by listening for the click. If the switch isn't clicking, the throttle cable may be too tight, and some slack can be added to the cable by releasing the 2 13mm jam nuts, then tightening the inside nut a few turns to move the cable sheath forward, and then locking the outside nut back down. At this point, you may have noticed we have another O-ring remaining in the kit, again one that's a little bit larger than the small shaft seals we used. This O-ring is for the Venturi tube that sits down below the air intake, and it applies to the 1983 to 1987 model years. This 1988 car features a Venturi delete from the factory, but if you're working on an earlier car, the hose clamps can be removed from the Venturi tube and the 2 pieces of the tube separated by twisting and pulling on the end. Inside, you'll find a small O-ring that can be replaced using the last one included in the kit. It's now time to reinstall the air filter housing and airflow meter. Start by positioning the assembly back into the engine bay with the cold air intake tube first. Push the intake J-boot onto the airflow meter and secure the ring clamp with a screwdriver. Next, reattach the breather hose to the side of the airbox and tighten down the ring clamp. Secure the filter housing by reinstalling the 2 10mm bolts on the front mounting bracket, followed by the 2 on the rear mounting bracket. Finally, reconnect the electrical connector for the airflow meter, ensuring it fully clicks into place. You can now start the car and check for normal operation, and with that, you've successfully rebuilt the throttle body on your Porsche 944.